Have you ever felt like society, I don't know, subtly nudges your behavior in ways you don't quite get?
Mm-hmm.
What if those nudges weren't just, trends, but actual intentional forms of control, just uh, disguised as something else?
That's a powerful thought.
Yeah. And it's really the unsettling question at the heart of our deep dive today.
Yeah.
We're peeling back the layers on Peter Schrag's 1978 book, Mind Control.
A provocative title, even then.
Totally. And when you hear mind control,
Uh-huh.
okay, your mind probably jumps to, like, the CIA's MK Ultra program, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe really overt prison abuse.
The stuff of headlines and, frankly, horror stories.
Exactly. But Schrag's core idea here goes way deeper into something much more pervasive, maybe more insidious.
I think that's fair to say.
He argues there's this growing tendency, even back then, to employ new methods of intervention, to create wholly new systems of treatment, and to promote a new ideology of control.
In which society itself becomes more and more like a closed institution. That's the kicker.
Right, society itself becoming like a prison or an asylum. It's a chilling thought, isn't it?
It truly is. And what's so insightful about Schrag's work, even looking back from today, is how he pinpoints this huge shift happening already in the late 70s.
A shift away from.
Away from the obvious stuff like overt punishment, clear institutional walls, towards methods presented as more humane. But paradoxically, because they seem humane, they become more insidious forms of management.
Okay, how so?
Well, they're often cloaked in medical language, you see, presented as therapeutic, beneficial. So our mission today, really, is to extract the critical insights from Schrag's incredibly detailed work.
Yeah, let's dig in.
We'll trace how these subtle mechanisms started blurring the lines between what used to be seen as social problems, things like poverty, or maybe just dissatisfaction with your life,
Mm-hmm.
and what then became framed as medical ailments, things requiring clinical intervention.
So reframing the problem makes the solution different.
Precisely. And that reframing made interventions much easier, more socially acceptable. And ultimately, it raised these profound questions about individual autonomy, about freedom itself.
And just to be super clear for everyone listening, Schrag isn't just throwing out wild ideas here. This isn't like conspiracy theory territory.
Not at all. His analysis is incredibly well-grounded.
Yeah, he's drawing on a huge range of sources, right? Academic journals, medical papers, civil liberties reports. It's meticulously researched.
Absolutely. It's based on the documented realities of the time.
So this deep dive isn't just some interesting historical detour. It's really a factual exploration of a societal shift that, well, arguably has massive echoes even today, decades later.
The patterns he identified are still incredibly relevant.
Okay, so let's start by really unpacking Schrag's central argument, because like you said, it's foundational.
Mm-hmm.
The book, as he lays it out, is emphatically not about the CIA messing with people's minds or the really harsh conditions in traditional prisons.
He sets that aside deliberately.
Right. He focuses instead on this pervasive, subtle form of control that was already spreading beyond the walls of institutions back then.
Yeah, into the community.
He saw this really troubling trend. Each year, more people outside institutions are drugged, screened, tested, questioned, watched, and followed.
And more are subject to those rituals of mortification as if they were inmates.
Think about that. The daily routines, the scrutiny, the kind of subtle pressures once only found behind bars or in a mental hospital ward, suddenly appearing in everyday life.
It's a creep, a seepage of institutional logic into the open.
And it wasn't always straightforward coercion either. Schrag points out this whole spectrum of participation.
Right, it wasn't always clear-cut.
He says some are volunteers, some are conscripts, and some fall into a gray area where no one can be certain whether they're one or the other.
That gray area is crucial. Is someone seeking help voluntarily, or are they being pressured subtly or not so subtly into accepting an intervention?
Exactly. This blurring where the things that used to only happen inside became possible outside, in the community. That's really the core of his argument, isn't it?
It is. It's about this creeping expansion of institutional methods and mindsets into the fabric of society.
And what's driving this, according to Schrag? What's the vision behind it?
Well, he describes it as a vision of sanitized social efficiency. And the language used to sell this vision, it's strikingly clinical.
Okay.
In this new way of thinking, mental health isn't just a state of being. It becomes, as he puts it, the most important symbol.
Why is that so significant?
Because, as he really sharply analyzes, each new level of humane treatment and every refinement in behavior technology makes intervention easier.
Yeah.
Each gets around more legal, economic, or ethical objections. Each enhances the authority of the institution that employs it.
So the nicer it looks on the surface, the less people object and the more power the system gains.
Precisely. It's a very clever, almost, insidious dynamic. The appearance of being less punitive actually lowers the bar for intervention. Wow.
And this vision, for some of the behaviorists Schrag was looking at, culminates in what he calls, quite chillingly, the paranoid's dream.
Which is?
A method of control so smooth, so seamless, that no one will know his behavior is being manipulated and against which no resistance is therefore possible.
Okay, that's terrifying. Does he think that actually exists?
He acknowledges a perfect technology like that probably doesn't exist or didn't then, but the direction society was moving in, even in the 70s, was undeniably towards that kind of subtle management.
And this leads to?
What he calls a subtle, seductive process of mystification.
Mystification, meaning?
Meaning it teaches people certain things, often without them realizing it. It instills certain beliefs.
Like what?
Well, firstly, that their own minds, their behavior, are subject to chemical or other processes maybe outside their full control.
Okay, makes you feel a bit powerless.
Exactly. Secondly, that there are professionals, experts, who frequently know more about him than he knows about himself and who can better understand his real interests.
Undermining self-knowledge. Thirdly, that it is normal to be watched, tested, and questioned by the agents of social service. It normalizes surveillance.
Okay.
And maybe the biggest one. It subtly teaches that institutional demands and, frankly, arbitrary social standards are themselves just part of the natural order of things.
Wow, so it makes the system seem inevitable, natural.
Precisely. The core insight here is that by medicalizing life's struggles, the struggles that come with poverty, bad housing, or just being human society, creates this almost irresistible path for intervention. It shifts the blame, subtly, from systemic problems onto the individual's supposed internal pathology.
So the big question then is, what does this mean for us now? Are we, still caught up in this mystification, maybe without even realizing it?
That's exactly the question Schrag forces us to confront.
Right.
If the appearance of humane treatment actually disarms resistance and gives institutions more power, how do we even spot it?
Yeah, it sounds almost invisible. Like, how would you recognize it if it's framed as help?
Well, Schrag suggests looking at what gets labeled as a medical ailment. Are we talking about problems that clearly stem from social conditions, poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity, and are they being reframed as individual psychological failings needing treatment?
So it's about tracing the problem back to its roots, societal versus individual.
Exactly. Recognizing that pattern, that reframing, is the crucial first step. He argues it's a way to manage dissent and discomfort without actually changing the underlying structures.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's dig into the historical context then, because understanding where these efficiency ideas came from feels really important.
Absolutely. Schrag traces it back quite powerfully to the early 20th century.
Where specifically?
To Frederick Winslow Taylor and his concept of scientific management.
Ah, the efficiency guru.
Right. But Taylor wasn't just optimizing machines on a factory floor. He was applying these principles directly to human labor, treating people almost like components.
How did that work in practice?
His system was all about breaking jobs down into their absolute smallest parts, what he called behaviors,
Okay.
then meticulously measuring them, analyzing them, timing everything, and restructuring the whole process for maximum efficiency. He literally wrote everything was timed with a stopwatch, all false movements, slow movements, and useless movements eliminated.
Wow. Just scribbing away anything deemed inefficient.
Completely. The goal was to assemble the quickest and best movements into one perfect sequence. It's a deeply mechanistic view of human work.
And Schrag gives that example, right? The pig iron handler, Schmidt.
Yes, that's a really stark illustration. Taylor's description of Schmidt is just incredible. He called him a man of the type of the ox, so stupid that he was unfitted to do most kinds of laboring work even.
That's unbelievably insulting.
It is. He even claimed the job was so basic that it would be possible to train an intelligent gorilla to do it better.
Jeez.
But through Taylor's rigid methods, this man Schmidt was supposedly taught to increase his daily output from 12.5 tons to 47.5 tons. A huge jump.
Okay, so the method worked in terms of output, but the human cost.
Well, listen to how Taylor described talking to him. He recounts telling Schmidt, well, if you are a high-priced man, you will do exactly as this man tells you tomorrow, from morning till night. When he tells you to pick up a pig and walk, you pick it up and you walk, and what's more, no back talk.
Just pure command and control.
Taylor called it rough talk, but thought it was totally appropriate for someone he saw as mentally sluggish. It just powerfully shows this core belief in optimizing and controlling human behavior, even through means we'd now see as deeply demeaning, all for efficiency.
And this factory floor thinking didn't stay in the factory, did it?
Not at all. This industrial efficiency mindset quickly bled into broader societal attempts at control, especially through things like eugenics and mental testing.
Click those dots.
There was this widespread belief, really, that you could have a science of behavior that was just as rigorous, just as predictable as physics or chemistry.
A dangerous idea when applied to people.
Extremely dangerous. It fueled these race betterment movements that openly advocated for sterilizing or segregating people they labeled genetically unfit.
How many people were they talking about?
Their estimates were huge. Up to 10% of the population they thought fell into this category. There was this pervasive fear of race degeneration.
Through what?
Oh, all sorts of things. And this deeply flawed belief that traits like immorality, crime, low intelligence, and mental disease were often related. For instance, the absolutely abhorrent idea that feeble-minded girls were automatically potential prostitutes.
Just awful stereotyping based on flimsy labels.
And it had devastating real-world impact. Schrag mentions Louis Terman, a big name in the California Human Betterment Foundation. He's credited with overseeing something like 6,200 eugenic sterilizations just in the 1920s.
6,000. Just staggering.
And incredibly, even as late as 1966, right in the middle of the civil rights era, you had figures like Henry E. Garrett, a former president of the APA, a Columbia professor, publicly arguing for inherent racial and ethnic differences in ability and intelligence.
Still pushing that narrative in 66.
Yes. Saying things like, a 10% differential spills the difference between a spire and a mud hut, between a cultured society and savagery. Schrag includes these quotes not to endorse them, obviously, but to show the deeply disturbing pseudoscientific and racist foundations underpinning these movements.
Right. It's crucial context.
These tests, these classifications, they essentially made scientific what had always been known about deviance, as Schrag puts it. They gave a veneer of objectivity to pre-existing prejudices.
And who were they targeting with this science?
It wasn't just the explicitly labeled feeble-minded, insane, criminalistic, epileptic, inebriate, diseased, blind, deaf, deformed, and dependent. In the industrial context, it was also the Schmitz, the Wobblies, the Bolsheviks, and the labor agitators. Anyone who didn't fit the mold or challenge the system.
So it was a tool for social control wrapped in scientific language.
Precisely. Which raises that critical question. When does science stop being science and start being a tool for social engineering, often with disastrous consequences? It's the danger of prejudice wearing a lab coat.
That is a deeply disturbing historical thread. It really shows how a seemingly neutral idea like efficiency can warp into something truly sinister when applied to people.
Absolutely. And that theme, the idea of categorizing and controlling populations for some idealized betterment, it's something we constantly need to be vigilant about.
Okay, let's shift gears now, move forward in time to the mid-20th century, specifically post-World War II. Schrag talks about the explosive growth of what he calls the madness network.
Yes, the psychiatric establishment specifically.
The numbers he cites are just wild. Before WWII, barely 3,000 psychiatrists in America.
A relatively small field.
And by 1950, partly because of military medicine and policies encouraging psychiatric intervention during the war, that jumps to 7,500.
A significant increase already.
But then, by 1976, there are roughly 30,000 psychiatrists. Almost all trained with heavy support from NIMH, grants the National Institute of Mental Health.
Yeah, the federal government basically bankrolled this massive expansion.
He notes the government alone supported twice as many psychiatrists in '76 as existed in the entire country before the war.
Yep.
It's a huge structural change.
It really is, driven largely by legislation like the National Mental Health Act of 1946.
Right, which created NIMH.
And NIMH became the engine, really, providing fellowships, training grants, money for state clinics, research funds. It became the biggest sponsor and promoter of the whole idea of mental health.
And the people running it had some pretty expansive ideas about who needed help.
Incredibly broad claims. Robert H. Felix, an early NIMH director, was throwing around figures like 1 American in 10 who needed psychiatric help.
Pun intent.
And later, Bertram S. Brown, another director, testified to Congress that maybe as many as 40 million Americans 1 of 5 needed psychiatric care.
1 in 5. That's an epidemic level.
Exactly. The concept of mental health wasn't just about treating severe, debilitating illness anymore. It rapidly expanded into this idea of public health. You had figures like Leopold Belloc arguing for required legislation to protect the community against emotional contamination.
Emotional contamination, like it's a virus.
Precisely. It framed mental distress not just as an individual problem, but as a societal threat requiring broad, almost preventative intervention. It turned a health issue into a matter of social order and control.
And a key tool in managing this perceived epidemic was
Psychoactive drugs, absolutely central. Schrag documents the dramatic rise of drugs like Valium, 61 million prescriptions in 1975 alone.
61 million.
And get this, 2/3 of those prescriptions were for women.
Wow. Okay.
But the real game changer, the drug that really enabled this mass scaling of intervention, was thorazine chlorpromazine, which came along in the early 50s.
And what's Schrag's take on what these drugs actually did?
He makes a really crucial point. They never cure anything. At best, they constitute a technology of maintenance.
Maintenance, not cure.
Right. They allow therapists or institutions to control or reduce hallucinations, bizarre behavior, or other symptoms. They manage the outward signs, the presentation, but they don't necessarily fix the underlying problem.
So they were essentially management tools.
That's how they were often viewed and used. And the advertising for these drugs can be pretty revealing, sometimes quite disturbing.
Like the Howball ad.
Exactly. Schrag cites this 1974 two-page ad for Haldol. It showed this image of a, quote, swarthy, dark-skinned, thick-lipped, leather-jacketed young man, fist clenched, under the headline, assaultive and belligerent.
Oh, wow. Loaded imagery.
Extremely. And the tagline was, cooperation often begins with Haldol. It couldn't be clearer. Use this drug to manage people perceived as threatening or difficult. Social control via medication.
Not exactly patient-centered care.
Hardly. And the mechanism Schrag describes is particularly insidious. If the drug works, the problem must be the ailment for which the drug was indicated.
So the drug becomes the diagnostic tool.
If it doesn't, try something else, or try several drugs at once, or increase the dosage until the patient is stupefied. It basically validates the treatment by its effect, regardless of the actual cause.
A circular logic.
Completely. Ultimately, Schrag argues, these drugs were often designed and used as management devices for relatives, for doctors, for institutions, for society, not primarily as a technology controlled by the client.
For everyone except the person taking them, almost.
In many cases, that seemed to be the dynamic. And to really underscore the societal impact, during the time Schrag was writing, the DEA's own figures show that Valium was involved in more drug-related deaths and emergency room visits than heroin, marijuana, or alcohol.
More than heroin. That's genuinely shocking. Prescribed drugs causing more acute crises.
It highlights this massive, often hidden cost of this heavily medicated system, even when the drugs were perfectly legal and prescribed.
That statistic really makes you pause and think about the definition of progress in this context.
Exactly. Is it real progress if we're just masking symptoms, maybe creating new problems, instead of addressing the roots?
So let's get into who was being targeted by this expanding system. Because the pattern Schrag uncovers in prescription rates are, well, they're pretty stark.
They are deeply disturbing, frankly. Studies from clinics in California at the time showed a clear disparity.
Which was?
White men and women are the least likely to get drug therapy, and black men and women the most likely.
A clear racial bias in drugging.
And Schrag includes this case report that's just chilling.
Yeah.
Mrs. J, a 39-year-old black woman, diagnosis deferred. She's described as cheerful, looking well, and feeling fine, but has pressured speech and trembling knees.
Okay, sounds maybe anxious, but generally okay.
Right. But she was given phenothiazine's powerful antipsychotic drugs because, and this is the quote from the worker, she does seem to need it.
Based on what? Trembling knees and pressured speech.
It speaks volumes about this ingrained professional folklore, as Schrag calls it, that essentially believed the poor and the black are crazier in degree and in number than the rest of the population.
Just blatant prejudice embedded in the system.
He quotes a therapist from an Oakland clinic summing up this view. Their problems tend more often to be psychotic and difficult to treat. They're not motivated to help themselves. The concept is you go to a doctor and he fixes you, not you fix yourself, just layering assumption upon assumption.
Wow. And this targeting wasn't just about race, was it? Age played a role, too.
Definitely. Schrag points out that outside of mental institutions themselves, where basically everyone was drugged, the heaviest drugging occurred in old age nursing homes.
Why there?
Well, patients there had average annual drug bills of $300 back then, $60 of that just for tranquilizers. Thorazine and Mellaril were common, multiple prescriptions per person per year.
And the rationale? Patient well-being.
Often, it seemed more about managing the workload. Schrag mentions ads in nursing home trade journals for Mellaril claiming staff find their workload greatly lightened as patient demands are replaced by a spirit of self-help. It's drugging for staff convenience.
Sedation is a management tool.
And it's crucial to remember, as Schrag notes, that the heaviest prescribers weren't necessarily psychiatrists.
Who was it then?
General practitioners, internists, gynecologists, the primary care doctors, they became the front line for this kind of intervention.
So this system reached way beyond specialized psychiatric care into everyday medicine.
Deeply embedded. And broadening that lens again, the system disproportionately impacted women. Schrag draws on work by sociologist Pauline Bart about maternal role loss.
What's that?
Bart's research suggested depression was common among women who felt they'd lost their primary roles as mothers or housewives. The highest rates were among housewives experiencing this loss who also had, quote, overprotective or over-involved relationships with their children.
So social roles and life transitions being medicalized.
Exactly. And while critics like Phyllis Chesler pointed out the social origins of women's mental illness, Schrag notes they often still accepted the premise that it was real illness, even if socially produced.
Which kept the door open for medical intervention.
Precisely. It blurred that line between social distress and medical pathology, making intervention seem appropriate, especially for these vulnerable groups.
And the line between choosing treatment and being forced into it, that was blurry too.
Incredibly thin, often non-existent historically, Schrag digs up this astonishing 19th century Illinois law.
What did it allow?
It allowed married women to be entered or detained in the hospital at the request of the husband without the evidence of insanity required in other cases.
Just based on the husband's request? No proof needed?
Essentially, yes. It highlights how easily the label of illness could become this available social role, particularly for marginalized groups, and how treatment could function purely as social control. It forces that critical question again. When is it genuine treatment, and when is it just a convenient way to manage people's sin? Society finds troublesome.
That Illinois law is just staggering. A raw example of power imbalance enforced through medicine. And what Schrag gets into next is fascinating, especially for understanding the sheer power of labels.
Yes, the Rosenhan study.
Right, D.L. Rosenhan's 1973 experiment on being sane in insane places. It's legendary, really.
And deeply unsettling.
He set up this incredible experiment. Pseudo-patients, perfectly sane people, faked one symptom. Just one. They said they were hearing voices.
Hearing words like empty, hollow, thud.
Right. So, as soon as they got admitted to psychiatric hospitals, they stopped faking anything, behaved completely normally.
Then the punchline.
None of them. None were detected as fakes by the hospital staff.
Despite behaving normally once inside.
Yeah. With just one exception, they were all admitted with a diagnosis of schizophrenia.
Stuck with that label.
And the study just powerfully highlighted, as Schrag puts it, the facile way labels are applied, the extent to which they distort all subsequent perceptions of the individual.
Including, eventually, the individual's perception of himself.
And the difficulty, if not the impossibility, of escaping the label and its stigma once they are attached.
Rosenhan himself said it best. Once the impression has been formed that the patient is schizophrenic, the expectation is that he will continue to be schizophrenic. Everything gets interpreted through that lens.
And it wasn't just a label. These pseudo-patients were given pills, right?
Oh, yeah. Nearly 2,100 psychoactive pills among them, which they accepted politely but didn't actually swallow.
But they saw the real patients taking them.
Exactly. It showed how pervasive the drugging was once that label was slapped on, regardless of the person's actual state.
This study really blew the lid off the subjective nature of diagnosis, didn't it?
It massively reinforced how problematic psychiatric diagnosis could be, especially as its scope kept broadening. Schrag argues these labels basically take things that are vague, impressionistic, anecdotal, and unscientific and give them this appearance of diagnostic precision.
Like putting a scientific-sounding name on a feeling. Thud becomes Thorazine.
Precisely. And this fed into that historical, conventional, professional wisdom, which was deeply flawed and unscientific that the sickest were the poor and the black.
Going back to those racist theories.
Yeah, Schrag cites them again. theories from 1913 claiming black people had learned no lessons in emotional control, or from the mid-20s suggesting dementia precox. An old term for schizophrenia was more common among Negroes than among whites. Just garbage science used to justify discriminatory labeling.
And the definition of disorder just kept expanding.
But relentlessly, it grew to include almost any complaint. They even had categories like parapsychiatric conditions.
And so it's covered what?
Things like school retardation, truancy, unruliness, sexual immorality, criminal tendency, vagrancy, welfare recipiency, inebriety, drug habits, and domestic maladjustment.
So basically any form of social nonconformity or struggle could get you labeled.
Pretty much. It cast this incredibly wide net, pulling almost anyone who deviated from the norm into the potential purview of mental health diagnosis and intervention. It medicalized a massive range of human behavior and social problems.
We've talked about how easily the labels were applied, how they warped perception. But Schrag really drives home the human cost with individual stories.
Yes, the case studies are incredibly powerful. They make it real.
Let's look at a few. First, there's Jack Parker.
The football player.
Right. Promising player, gets a back injury, life kind of goes off track, ends up in these loud, ugly arguments with his father. The father keeps calling the police.
Leading to hospital evaluations.
Twice. Then a fourth argument leads to a third trip. Now get this. A social worker writes an affidavit saying Jack had never been physically violent, and that the father seemed to be deliberately provoking him, attempted to make Jack blow up.
Okay, so context matters.
You'd think. But the prosecutor still tries to keep Jack locked up. The reason? He claimed Jack was gravely disabled because he spent money unwisely.
Spending habits as proof of grave disability, that's a stretch.
Totally. And the judge, in this incredibly brief 6-minute hearing, seemed mainly focused on Jack's ability to take his medicine. Orders him back to the hospital. A family dispute, maybe some poor financial choices, reframed as severe mental incompetence requiring institutionalization and medication.
A life derailed by labels and assumptions.
Then there's the case of Collins.
What happened to him?
He gets labeled schizophrenic reaction, paranoid type after just one incident at work. Hospitalized for a week.
Okay.
After treatment, to get clearance, he's required to be certified as well by a top-tier psychiatrist, a diplomate of the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology.
A very high bar.
Especially since 2 other doctors had already said he was within the limits of normal, it just shows the immense power of that initial label. Once it's on you, you have to jump through these absurd hoops to prove you're okay, even when you clearly are.
The label sticks, and the burden of proof shifts entirely onto the individual.
And the last one, just heartbreaking, the welfare hotel woman.
Tell us about her.
A 58-year-old woman living in a welfare hotel, she's a Christian Scientist, has a physical issue causing frequent toilet use, but refuses medical help because of her beliefs.
Okay, a conflict between her needs, beliefs, and living situation.
Right. She's seen as a nuisance by the hotel. She writes letters of complaint to the city authorities. What happens?
Let me guess.
She gets institutionalized. The welfare department note focused on her inability to leave her room or clean herself up enough to be acceptable in a public hotel. It became this catch-22, Schrag says. She's trapped. Institutionalized for what were basically social problems, physical health issues, and her adherence to her religious beliefs.
These stories just vividly show how easily people, especially those without power or resources or those just outside the norm, could get swept up and controlled by this system.
Absolutely. And these individual cases point to a bigger issue Schrag tackles. The whole idea of preventative psychiatry programs and their effectiveness, or lack thereof.
Right. He quotes a psychiatrist from Albany Medical College who had this incredibly candid take.
What did he say?
He said, "It seems that we are trying to saturate the environment with therapy as though we were randomly filling the skies with massive amounts of flak without knowing whether the weapons have any value or if the enemy is even within range."
Wow. Just throwing treatments out there without knowing if they work or who they're hitting.
That's the picture he paints. And it's compounded by this stunning lack of evaluation. Schrag notes that amidst this avalanche of official statistics about programs and funding, there was virtually nothing you could use to actually gauge success or failure.
No one was checking if it actually helped.
Asking for evaluation, Schrag observed, was like questioning the long-range value of baptism during a christening. It just wasn't done. It was assumed to be good.
So what do these programs provide in Schrag's view?
He concludes that for many people, the most important thing community and mental health provides is not mental health, but community. Or maybe just a sympathetic ear, a sense of care.
Which sounds nice, but
Yeah. But he argues it often functions as a kind of diversion. It creates a new concern for the client, a new relationship, an occupation in which the patient gets something new, an ailment, a syndrome, a problem to think about and work on.
so it redirects their focus inward onto a manageable illness instead of outward onto maybe the real social problems.
Exactly, it shifts the focus. Which leads back to that question. When we apply medical approaches to social issues without rigorous checks, what are the real outcomes? Is it genuine help? Or is it just a sophisticated way of managing difficult people in difficult situations, giving them the identity of patient instead of, say, dissatisfied citizen?
That is a powerful and deeply relevant question. It's almost like the system found a way to treat the symptoms of social inequality as if they were individual medical failings.
Precisely. Redirecting attention, resources, and responsibility away from systemic change towards individual adjustment.
Okay, now we need to talk about the really dark side of treatment that Schrag details. Electroshock therapy, ECT, and psychosurgery.
Yeah, these are the heavy hitters.
Schrag points out that if you took drugs off the table, the main options left for managing difficult patients were locking them up, expensive talk therapy, or these two drastic measures.
Even proponents admitted they were only for serious or intractable cases.
He recounts the truly chilling story of the birth of ECT back in 1938 with Ugo Cerletti in Italy.
It's quite a scene.
Cerletti gives this patient the first shock. The patient apparently bursts into song. Then Cerletti suggests a higher voltage. His staff are freaking out, thinking it'll kill the guy.
Understandable reaction.
But before Cerletti can even respond, the patient sits bolt upright and yells in Italian, "Non una seconda, mortifer."
Not again, it will kill me.
Exactly. A clear, conscious plea. But Cerletti, as Schrag puts it, his courage was not lost. He orders them to proceed with a higher voltage, longer duration, and bam, the first electroconvulsion in a human.
Willful disregard for the patient's stated fear.
And here's the absolute key. Schrag emphasizes, neither Cerletti nor his contemporaries ever learned how ECT worked, nor do any of their successors understand it today. The mechanism was, and largely remains, a mystery.
Applying a treatment without knowing how or why it works, that's problematic.
And the side effects, particularly memory loss, were devastating. Schrag includes these harrowing personal accounts.
Yeah, the human cost is stark.
There's David, whose friend said after treatments he forgot everything, his writing, his yoga, all his good things. It left him without a personality, without a memory, without even knowing where the bathroom is.
Just erased.
Beatrice Rosenthal testified that after 50 treatments, the greater part of my past life was either erased or rendered very vague.
50 treatments.
And tragically, Ernest Hemingway, before his suicide, complained bitterly about it. What is the sense of ruining my head and erasing my memory, which is my capital, and putting me out of business?
Seeing his own mind, his capital, being destroyed by the treatment.
Even psychiatrists acknowledge the risks. A 1972 Massachusetts survey found 10 out of 66 psychiatrists admitted the treatments leave irrecoverable gaps in memory, and many treatments could cause intellectual deterioration, seizures, or personality blunting akin to lobotomy.
So these weren't rare or unknown side effects. They were known risks.
And some theories about why it might work were even more disturbing, suggesting it wasn't just about memory loss.
Like Dr. Rubin's theory.
Yeah, Dr. Richard D. Rubin theorized it could be aversive conditioning, timing the shock to hit right when the patient had the disturbing thought or behavior the therapist wanted to eliminate.
Associating the thought with intense pain and confusion.
He directly compared it to animal experiments, noting that if one zaps the rat often enough on its way to get a food pellet, one can teach it to starve to death.
That comparison is just jaw-dropping. Equating ECT with training a rat to starve itself through aversion, it reframes the treatment as potentially deliberate punishment.
It's an astonishing admission, really. Okay, moving from ECT to psychosurgery, we get into even more gruesome territory.
The infamous lobotomies.
Right. Schrag details the early ice pick lobotomies pioneered by Walter Freeman and James Watts. He describes it as a bloodless and thoroughly horrifying experience.
How did it work?
Basically accessing the brain through the eye socket with an instrument resembling an ice pick. The patient would wake up deprived of a significant chunk of his intellectual capacity.
But this was seen as desirable.
By Freeman and Watts, horrifyingly, yes. They believed, quote, "It is better for the patient to have a simplified intellect capable of elementary acts than an intellect where there reigns this disorder of subtle synthesis." Basically, dumbing people down was seen as a solution for society.
Turning complex human beings into simpler, more manageable units?
Mm.
Just awful.
Later, techniques evolved to stereotaxic methods, using electrodes to target deeper brain structures, supposedly for more precise effects.
But did they know what they were targeting?
That was the huge problem. Schrag stresses, no one knows with any precision which portions of the brain control which functions. A schizophrenic brain, an obsessive-compulsive brain, they look the same as any other human brain.
So they were operating blind, essentially.
Elliot Wallenstein is quoted saying there was no theoretical way at present of predicting the consequences of destruction of a particular structure. It was guesswork with catastrophic potential.
And Schrag gives an example of that potential.
Or yes, an extreme case. A 34-year-old woman with manic depressive psychosis, treated with a combo of Haldol and lithium. What happened?
Follow me.
She became prostrate, stuporous, and restless, with involuntary, purposeless movements, totally demented, incontinent, and did not respond to any commands or speak. She could swallow when fed, but was otherwise completely helpless.
My God.
In 1 week, Schrag quotes the report, she had been turned from a slightly crazy lady into a vegetable. And then, horrifyingly, this outcome was deliberately replicated in 3 other patients to test the hypothesis.
They intentionally turned people into vegetables to test a theory. That's beyond unethical. That's monstrous.
It's a chilling example of unchecked power and the dangers of intervention without understanding. Turning a slightly crazy lady into a vegetable, that phrase just sticks with you. It obliterates any definition of care.
Indeed. It shows that line between treatment and harm being not just blurred, but actively, horrifyingly crossed in the name of management. And from surgery, Schrag moves to an even more futuristic and maybe more alarming prospect.
Brain implants and remote control.
Exactly. He brings up Jose Delgado's famous experiment.
The bull.
Right. Implanting a radio-controlled electrode in a brave fighting bull's brain. Delgado stood in the ring and stopped the bull's charge dead in its tracks just by pressing a button on a transmitter.
The dramatic display of control.
But then, the chilling part. Schrag notes, a similar device has been implanted in the brain of a man given to uncontrollable bursts of rage. When he feels an attack coming on, he presses a button on his battery pack and remains peaceable.
Self-administered remote control of his own brain.
And then there was talk of the Schutzgabel machine, or behavior control transcoder, BTR.
What was that supposed to do?
Envisioned for high-risk prisoners. It would link to a modified missile tracking device, monitor their location, and potentially, quote, block further action by the subject by causing him to forget or abandon his project. Remote interruption of intent.
Wow. Minority Report territory almost.
It really forces that question again. When is treatment voluntary, and when does it become control or even torture? Especially if consent is questionable or the science is murky or the potential for abuse is so high, the idea of altering someone's brain physically or chemically to manage behavior, it opens this ethical Pandora's box.
A box that was just beginning to creak open in the 70s,
Yeah.
but the implications are massive today.
Okay, let's shift again. Schrag identifies this move away from direct invasive stuff towards broader surveillance and behavior modification in everyday life.
The benevolent eye, he calls it. Right. This pervasive gathering of personal information, touching almost everything. Think about the workplace, even back then. A 1974 Harvard Business Review survey he cites is eye-opening.
What did it find?
24% of firms use locker searches. 46% did package checks. 39% used electronic surveillance in high-risk areas. 52% used personality tests.
Personality tests for jobs.
Yeah. 10% used lie detectors. Almost half, 49%, did drug abuse checks. Even 10% used handwriting analysis sometimes. A lot of scrutiny.
Definitely. Snooping into employees' lives and minds.
And he highlights the Reed report. What was that?
A paper and pencil test designed to function like a lie detector, often used when job applicants in retail, banking, places like that.
And it asked.
Really intrusive stuff: gambling, drinking, drug habits, personal loans, even your spouse's salary. And the kicker, questions like, how much money, that did not belong to me, that I have taken from jobs I have held. Basically fishing for confessions of past dishonesty.
Wow. Just casting a wide net for any sign of risk.
And Schrag's point is that this data, even if collected for one supposedly legitimate reason, becomes this raw material of bureaucracy. And bureaucracy always generates a search for new ways to use it.
The data takes on a life of its own.
Exactly. Look at the FBI's National Crime Information Center, the NCIC. Schrag notes that in the 2 years after it went live in 1971, drunk driving arrests jumped hugely, from 640,000 to 940,000. Marijuana arrests almost doubled, 225,000 to 420,000.
Not because crime suddenly surged.
No, but because, as Schrag says, the arrests gave local police a chance to check suspects through the new computer. The existence of the database created more opportunities to use it, leading to more arrests, feeding more data back in. A cycle of control fueled by information.
That's a really important dynamic. The tech enables the control.
And this expansion of control also shows up in behavior modification techniques, moving way beyond clinics, right into social welfare and the justice system.
Like the New York Welfare Program.
Yeah, the Incentive for Independence program. Families had welfare money withheld and had to earn it back with points.
Points for what?
For things like kids cooperating with teachers, getting vaccinations, youth joining work programs, basically rewarding state-approved behaviors with basic subsistence money.
Turning welfare into behavior mod.
And it created this catch-22 for recipients who had to provide incredibly detailed reports, every dollar in and out, every household change, like pregnancy, job loss, disability, even naming kids over 16, granular surveillance and control over their lives.
Micromanaging poverty.
Then you had token economies popping up everywhere. Prisons were a prime example.
The START program.
Right, the federal START program. Inmates came in stripped of basic privileges. They had to earn points for things like showering, shaving, keeping their room tidy, accepting work assignments.
Points for basic hygiene.
Yes. To buy essentials like coffee or paper, or to climb through different tiers of privilege, all based on good behavior and institutional adjustment, total conformity rewarded.
And this was happening elsewhere too.
Oh yeah. Schools used points for recess or treats. Institutions for the intellectually disabled used tokens for doing chores like cleaning toilets, exchanged for food, or better conditions. It often involved this initial stripping process, reducing people to a baseline of deprivation, then forcing them to earn back basic amenities through compliance.
Dehumanizing.
Schrag even notes that some experts compared the psychological stripping forced confessions, humiliation, to Chinese brainwashing techniques. And an MIT psychologist apparently told American prison officials these techniques were not so different and not so awful.
Commending brainwashing techniques. That's chilling.
No, and to enforce this, there was actual hardware involved, right? An
Oh.
industry making devices.
Oh, yes. Schrag mentions a small industry of equipment manufacturers, making things like shockers, timers, pants alerts. Yeah, a wired pair of underpants which causes a buzzer to sound whenever urination is made in the pants. For conditioning bladder control.
Wow.
He focuses on one company, Feral Instrument Company. They sold an AR-5 receiver shocker.
What'd that do? Allowed for remote wireless shocking of humans. Used by over 100 institutions, apparently. Feral also sold slides specifically designed for aversive conditioning.
Slides for what kind of conditioning?
Targeting things like homosexual acts, attraction to young boys, viewing nude males, aggression, gambling, smoking.
So pairing images or thoughts of undesirable behavior with pain.
Exactly. Pairing the behavior with an electric shock or sometimes with emetic drugs, making someone vomit when they, say, pick up an alcoholic drink. Classic aversive conditioning.
But did any of this actually work therapeutically?
That's the devastating critique Schrag levels. There is almost no evidence that behavior modification of large groups and institutions has any therapeutic effect whatever.
All this effort, all this technology, these intrusive methods, for no real positive long-term outcome for the group.
Largely no. And this is where that line between therapy and punishment just gets completely obliterated. The Florida school example Schrag gives is horrific.
The one for the retarded in 1974.
Yes. They had a token economy, but it was combined with what investigators called programmed abuse.
Like what?
Forced public masturbation and forced public homosexual acts for engaging in prescribed sexual behavior, beating with a wooden panel for running away, and washing the mouth with soap for lying. Withholding food, sleep, forcing residents to lie in soiled sheets. One boy made to walk around publicly in women's underwear. Just sadistic degradation disguised as therapy.
It's almost unbelievable that was happening under the banner of treatment. It really does erase that line entirely. It raises the most profound ethical questions about power, control, and who gets labeled deviant.
That example is just a brutal illustration of how quickly therapy can become torture when the subjects are powerless and dehumanized, and the system lacks meaningful oversight.
So let's try to connect all these threads now. Schrag paints a picture of a larger system of control, an unseen grid weaving through society.
Yeah, it wasn't just isolated incidents, it was becoming systemic.
This grid extended deep into family life, didn't it? Schools looking for kids labeled ego-disturbed, or having minimal brain dysfunction,
Segregating hyperactive children.
and sometimes even pressuring parents into drugging them just to keep them quiet and compliant in class. School files even sometimes contain notes on parent politics or sex lives, the school becoming a subtle monitor.
An outpost of the surveillance state, almost.
And Child Protective Services became nodes in this grid, too. Reasonable suspicions, even if totally unfounded, could lead to permanent records in central databanks.
Creating lifelong digital shadows.
Police or social workers could take kids into protective custody, sometimes without even telling the parents first. And these local actions all fed into statewide databases, like Michigan's Automated Client Information System, CIS.
What did that system do?
Schrag says it held info on anyone currently getting state social services, or who had in the past 2 years. It linked welfare offices, agencies all across the state, an interconnected web of personal data on vulnerable populations, creating this comprehensive picture of individuals interacting with the state.
And the reach was just immense. Schrag describes this Department of Transportation project.
The one trying to spot problem drinkers.
Right. A $2 million project in D.C. When people renewed their driver's licenses, they'd face this 121-item psychological profile.
Asking about
Really personal stuff. Vacation habits, debts, feelings of loneliness, living arrangements, things seemingly unrelated to driving. What was the justification?
a National Highway Transportation Safety Administration psychologist claimed there was a correlation between income and problem drinking, saying lower socioeconomic groups seem to have more alcohol problems. Based on this shaky correlation, they wanted to profile people,
Profile them for what purpose?
to identify potential problem drinkers early and force them into medical evaluation and alcohol education just to keep their licenses. It's control through predictive profiling based on demographics and survey answers, extending state control deep into private lives, control through data and prediction. That sounds unnervingly familiar today.
Bringing it all together, Schrag argues there's been this enormous and continuing shift in how control operates, both institutional control over people and how people are taught to control themselves.
How does he characterize that shift?
He says it's a move from the overt to the covert, from the punitive to the therapeutic, from the hortatory to the manipulative, from the moralistic to the mechanistic.
So, less obvious punishment, more subtle management disguised as help.
Exactly. And in this new landscape, therapy, punishment, and control become indistinguishable. He quotes Richard D. Parler, a mental health director, basically saying punishment is just a semantic problem you can avoid by using phrases like aversive conditioning or negative consequences.
Just change the words, but the action is the same.
It's a reframing that makes discipline more palatable, harder to recognize for what it is.
And Schrag connects this to broader social changes.
Yes. He argues that as moral authority declines, its therapeutic authority grows. When people become, in his words, economically superfluous, maybe unemployed, outside the traditional workforce discipline, they must be disciplined by the social service system.
So the welfare state becomes a new kind of disciplinary system.
It transforms citizens into clients of the state, managed through therapeutic or quasi-therapeutic means outside the old economic structures. He points to someone like Dr. Ronald Feeve, who hailed lithium as the third revolution in psychiatry. Feeve claimed lithium was the first drug in the history of psychiatry to so radically and specifically control a major mind disorder, manic depression.
Oh, magic bullet.
That was the promise. But the irony Schrag highlights is that figures like Feeve and Nathan Klein predicted that this chemical approach would make traditional psychotherapy and analysis obsolete. In doing so, they almost made psychiatry itself obsolete, pushing psychiatric medicine back to GPs.
So the specialists were replaced by pills.
Schrag's conclusion is blunt. Psychiatry or mental health may be the rationale, but the service is drugs. That became the primary mode of intervention.
And this ties back to Delgado, the brain implant guy.
Yes, Delgado's chilling, quote, "The inviolability of the brain is only a social construct, like nudity."
Meaning our mental autonomy isn't sacred, it's just a convention we can discard.
That's the implication, that the mind can be altered, intervened upon for a perceived societal benefit. Schrag argues these new drugs and the whole ideology of specific chemical action, they democratized an idea previously confined to totalitarian societies and futuristic novels.
The idea that minds can be chemically managed on a mass scale.
Yes, and this blurs all the critical lines between mental illness and mental health, between therapy and control, and between treatment and manipulation. It fosters this belief in a kind of dual personality, a healthy, together, genuine, adjusted self that treatment aims for, versus the existing sick, malfunctioning, chemically imbalanced self that needs fixing. It divides the self against itself to justify intervention.
Which brings us back to an unsettling question for today. Living in our hyper-data-driven world, how much of our own behavior, our own sense of self, is truly autonomous? And how much is being shaped, nudged, managed by systems we're barely even aware of?
That's the ghost in the machine Schrag identified, and it haunts us still.
It's a really unsettling thought. The idea that our very sense of who we are could be kind of divided up and managed by outside forces challenges basic ideas of freedom.
Okay, so Schrag paints this bleak picture, but does he offer any way out, any criticisms or alternatives?
He does. He notes that even by the late 70s, there was growing public awareness of the dangers. More stories in the press, more lawsuits, more pressure for government regulation.
People were starting to push back, to some extent. Interestingly, he also observes a swing back to more overtly punitive methods in criminal justice. Around that time, things like fixed sentences instead of rehabilitation.
So a move away from the therapeutic model in prisons.
Yes, but, and this is key, he says, that pressure has not been accompanied by any reduction in programs of early intervention or in any significant legislative effort to keep marginal and status offenders out of the criminal justice and social service systems.
So one type of control might lessen, but others persist or even grow. It just shifts around.
Exactly. It's a subtle, erosive process, he calls it, where ultimately almost every client is a hostage to an exchange which trades momentary comfort and institutional peace for an indefinite future of maintenance and control.
A bleak trade-off.
But Schrag doesn't just leave us there. He does propose alternatives, some quite radical.
Okay, what does he suggest?
Well, some are what he calls the obvious ones. Things like full employment and a shift of resources from therapy and medical intervention to the improvement of the social conditions which often cause the problems in the first place.
Address the root causes, not just the symptoms. Makes sense.
Also, a conservative insistence that intervention be limited to serious cases. Don't medicalize everyday life. And critically, a willingness to tolerate diversity as difference and not as deviance. Plus, absolute prohibitions on service or treatment for unwilling clients. Respect autonomy.
So basically back off unless it's truly necessary and consensual and focus on fixing society, not people.
That's the gist of the obvious ones. He argues community mental health often ended up being a poor substitute for real community rather than fostering it.
But he had a less obvious, more radical proposal.
Yes, the big one. The complete separation of psychiatry and mental health from the power and resources of the state. The disestablishment of mental health.
Wow, get the state out of the mental health business entirely.
Pretty much. Eliminate involuntary commitment laws. Abolish government-mandated mental health screening.
And the funding.
Shift public funds away from doctors and institutions directly to the clients. Let them choose how to spend it, whether to use them for formal therapy or housing, or simply a month at the beach.
A month at the beach as therapy.
Schrag cheekily suggests it's likely to be at least as therapeutic as a month in the state asylum. His point is about empowering the individual.
And redefining mental health itself.
Absolutely. Above all, he says, redefine it from something that suggests certain normative standards of behavior to something that celebrates community and diversity. Stop trying to force everyone into the same mold.
That's a powerful vision.
And he ends with a strong statement about what it means to be a genuine professional in these fields.
Look at that obligation.
The first obligation is to understand and clarify the limits of what his profession can do, to insist on the scrupulous observation of limits, to be able to say, sorry, but I can't help, and to distinguish between matters of morals, politics, or culture, and matters of science, technology, or medicine. Knowing where your expertise ends and where ethics, choice, and diversity begin.
Humility and clear boundaries.
Which forces us, the listeners, to ask, in our world today, awash in data, algorithms, diagnostic labels, how do we protect our own autonomy? How do we champion diversity against these subtle, often technologically driven pressures to normalize us?
So today, we've really peeled back the layers of what Peter Schrag called mind control. We saw how societal pressures, anxieties, inequalities can get reframed as individual medical problems.
Making intervention seem necessary, even helpful.
And how that drive for efficiency and a certain definition of mental health could lead down some really dark paths, unintended consequences maybe, but also sometimes disturbing forms of control.
From scientific management and
And
eugenics
to the massive growth of psychiatry, fueled by drugs and broad diagnoses,
through ECT and psychosurgery.
and into that pervasive surveillance and behavior modification, creating that unseen grid. It's quite a journey he maps out.
And broadening our view one last time, Schrag's work from way back in 1978 really pushes us to ask, what are the new unseen mechanisms shaping our lives today in our digital age? How much real agency do we have in defining what it even means to be well or normal?
The tools are definitely different now. Smartphones, social media, AI profiling, constant connectivity.
The tools have evolved dramatically, but those fundamental questions about power, about knowledge, about who gets to define reality, and about individual freedom, they remain absolutely vital, maybe more vital than ever.
And maybe that is the most crucial thing to take away from this deep dive. The need to stay critically aware, right? To question the labels, the systems, the nudges.
To resist that subtle mystification.
Yeah, and to really fiercely guard our own autonomy, our own definition of ourselves, in what feels like an increasingly complex and controlling world. We really hope this exploration is giving you plenty to think about.
Food for thought, definitely.
Until next time, keep digging deeper.